subscribe.
Before we get started, I wanted to say that I'm playing Battlefield 1 on PS4. The reason this is relevant is because I should not have bought it on PS4. I really don't enjoy shooters on a controller. I grew up playing FPS games mainly on PC, so I like keyboard and mouse. Controller just feels too slow and clunky in comparison. Thanks to the massive auto aim whenever you look down sights though, my controller issues with Battlefield 1 were not as bad as they could have been. I'm also not really the main audience for this game. I've never touched a Call of Duty or any of the other Battlefield games before this one. I was drawn in mainly by the World War I setting. It was something that hadn't been done on a Battlefield scale before, and so I thought it could be interesting, since they'd have to change things up from a typical World War II or modern shooter. Actually, it turns out they didn't really need to do that. Battlefield 1 ended up playing like most other shooters, just with more primitive guns. Even still, they found a way to implement all the shooter archetypes, which I guess is fine for gameplay, but it wasn't really why I wanted to play the game. I hate to be the history buff with the stick up his ass, but this is World War I, right? I was hoping for something other than the same frantic running around like a chicken with its head cut off. I feel like this could have been helped with the maps, but most of them weren't really trying for that gameplay style, and if it did, it just gave snipers a chance to kill you from across the entire map. I thought the campaign was just alright. The war stories were mildly interesting, but it was really more fun to just mow down some bots. In most cases though, I had to play cat and mouse, and I'm not sure if that was intentional or I was just bad at the game. I don't mind cat and mouse with shooters, but it takes a lot of patience and wears me out pretty quickly. I was not a fan of the stealth sections though. I'm probably spoiled by the likes of Metal Gear and Dishonored, but it felt tacked on here. I think Battlefield 1 is a fine game. You can get a few hours out of the story or dick around in multiplayer and have a decent time. I'm just disappointed by the marketing and aesthetics of it all, frankly. I bought it expecting something different, but it didn't really play that way. Now I just have a Battlefield game sitting on my shelf. Nice job, EA.
6 out of 10!
I wish more people talked about Blob. It's one of my favorite games to put on if I want some cheering up or just want to have a good time. Everything is centered around this laid-back, fun aesthetic that is just mesmerizing. I can't think of another game quite like it. Everything here centers around color. Painting your way to the exit is not only a nice marker for progress, but ties into a creative instinct. I don't just want to paint to get to the end of the level. I want to see this gray landscape turn into a beautiful rainbow by the time I'm done with it. The gameplay here is pretty simple. It's really all jumping or stomping in some way, and I don't really mind it. In fact, I think it's smart that painting is more of a passive ability. It makes the game super accessible. Blob isn't here to stress you out with complicated mechanics or difficult enemies. It just wants you to have a good time and occasionally try to use that noggin to come up with some colors. I think that's cool. It's nice to have a game where you can just roll around and enjoy the atmosphere I've created, and listen to a cool soundtrack. It's when you start to push Blob that it shows some blind spots. I was so into the painting gameplay at first that I wanted to 100% everything, but that was not such a great idea. First off, I don't think it gets you anything, but I could be wrong. Second, the process of painting literally every object in the stage is really tedious. After multiple levels in a row where I couldn't find that last object or hidden building, even after combing the whole level, it became apparent that this wasn't the real intention for these. While you can paint everything if you want to, I think the Blob's levels were meant as more of an open playground. A canvas, if you will. White space is just as much of the picture as anything else. Paint as much as you want while keeping it fun and quick, and then Blob will be a great time.
8 out of 10!
I've wanted to get into Bethesda games for a while now. They were always big news in the gaming space. Everyone seemed to love them at the time. When Fallout 4 came out, it was all my friend group talked about for weeks. Something was always keeping me from playing them though. I watched a lot of gameplay of Bethesda games like Skyrim, seen people play Fallout 3 or New Vegas. Everyone I knew thought New Vegas was one of the best games ever made, but it just didn't look like something I'd enjoy. All the RPG mechanics and storylines looked like a lot to keep track of. The art style of Fallout in particular was disgusting, and I know that's not supposed to look pretty, but I can't help it. I grew up on bright colors. Somehow I convinced myself to buy Fallout 4 even though I had a good feeling I wouldn't like it. I guess I was hoping I was wrong, and that I could finally enjoy conversation about it with my friends. Well, I never got that chance, but I did finally play Fallout 4, and yeah, I was totally right. The game didn't really do anything for me. The one thing that kept me playing as long as I did was the premise. Seeing how Bethesda imagined the country after a nuclear apocalypse was interesting. Everything else was not so interesting. The story of Fallout 4 itself I found pretty boring. I just never really connected with the main quest. The side quests didn't really grab me either. It doesn't help that all the dialogue is portrayed through incredibly stiff animations and some hit or miss voice acting. I didn't find much joy out of the exploration. At first it was fun, but then you see a lot of similar stuff. Rundown buildings, dead trees, mutated zombies, etc. On my journey I ran into a lot of enemies and not so many items, so I decided to just try to blast through the main quest instead of wandering around. That's where it really fell apart. The main quest felt like this long drawn out thing that just had you going from place to place, each person you meet promising to help you find your kid until you move on to the next. I didn't get very far before calling it quits, because Fallout 4 is a big game. I don't really want to spend all that time to see if it ever gets good if I was already skeptical about it from the beginning. If people like this, then cool. I played it enough to confirm my suspicions and that's really all I need.
4 out of 10!
Journey is one of those games that's more like an experience than a traditional game. Its wonderful music, gorgeous visuals, simple gameplay, and story make it one of those games that crosses boundaries. I fully believe that anyone, gamer or not, can pick up Journey and appreciate what's in front of them. It's not about appealing to those hardcore people who like stats and numbers or complex stories, no. It just wants to provide a unique interactive experience. Gameplay-wise, Journey is incredibly simple. Most of your time is just spent walking around and jumping across gaps, but even so, I was fully enjoying it the whole time. The subtle thing the shallow mechanics do is force you to look around. There's not really any complex systems to tunnel vision on to get to the finish. Instead, you're pushed to take in the visuals and sounds, and this is where Journey is at its best. This game is just full of spectacular set pieces, accompanied by wonderful orchestration and driven by a particular art style in a way that just makes Journey age incredibly well in my opinion. You'll go from deserts to caves to the mountaintop where the finale awaits, and I love the use of the mountain as this waypoint. It's the main goal you have in Journey and it's used very well. The closer you get, the larger the mountain becomes in the background, and there are some areas that obscure your view of it in order to heighten tension. The online component is also pretty cool. At random points in your adventure, you may be accompanied by another faceless character, which is in fact another player, just like you. You can't talk to each other, but you can help each other through tricky sections and take in the views together. It becomes this bonding experience going through the ups and downs with another person. Always that separation of anonymity, but brought together by a common goal. Journey is a very artsy game, if you couldn't tell already. It's not really concerned with traditional gaming stuff like missions and leveling and combat or even very complex movement, but that's obviously not what it's going for. Journey is all about the atmosphere. At points I felt like I was walking through a painting. If that's not something that interests you, then I think it's okay to skip Journey, even though I'd still recommend you try it. My only other problem with it is that it's really short. You can finish it in about 2 hours, and that's the only thing that makes recommending it difficult, because it's also a bit expensive for that little content. But personally, I think that content is so rich that I'd still recommend it to anyone.
9 out of 10!
Metal Gear Solid 5 is a special game. There was a point while I was playing where I realized this for the first time. It was about the midpoint where I realized how much time I had sunk in and still how much I hadn't even touched on all fronts. How much of the map I hadn't yet set foot on, how much was left of just the main story, even how the gameplay, the mechanics, and AI all felt so deep and intricate. I don't normally like long games like this, but at this point in my journey I was amazed and excited by the prospect of how much was left to discover. The game clicked with me right away. From the beginning, the Phantom Pain was much more gameplay focused. Even in the hospital sequence at the start, there were so many more instances of letting the player control what would normally be a straight cutscene. But when you get into that open world, that's where it really took off. I'm one of those people who prefer the stealth action gameplay over the story of these Metal Gear games. Something about the previous games always felt clunky for one reason or another, but the way MGS5 controls is perfect. I can't think of any real complaints I have on that front. The incredible feel this game has seamlessly weaved its way into the gameplay, making this wonderful blend of player input and game reaction. The AI is really smart, but Snake always has the advantage due to his athletics and arsenal of tricks, which makes it really fun to mess with the soldiers in any way you like. The open world allows you to approach a single situation in a multitude of different ways. It's this freedom of choice, not exactly in what you're doing, but in how you're doing it, that finally brings the stealth action gameplay to its full potential, and I love it so much. The glue that holds it together for me is reflex mode. When I was getting a grasp of how MGS5 worked in the beginning, I would use and abuse reflex mode a lot. As much as I used it though, it always felt more satisfying to take down soldiers without a single trace. As I got more proficient with the game's mechanics, I used reflex mode less and less, but it was still there in case I needed it. It actually nudged me to learn the game, and by the end I was a lot better than when I had started. There's a lot to say about the Phantom Pain. After I beat it, I went on YouTube and watched hours-long documentaries and plot synopses on it. There's so much here that it will never fit in a short review like the ones I make. The only thing I didn't like was the final stretch. Those last 10 missions or so where you have to repeat old missions with new stipulations. In a game filled with freedom, it felt oddly limiting, and all it did for me was bring the pace to a screeching halt. Given how big this game is, that last stretch was quite a few hours too. It sucked. So, it ain't perfect, but everything else in this game is so damn good, it's pretty close for me.
9 out of 10!
So in the final step to try to like sports games, I picked up this game, MLB The Show 17. I think I got it in 2018 or 19, so it was super cheap and I didn't care one bit about the rosters. I thought of all the sports games I'd like, it'd be a baseball game. I grew up on baseball, Little League, trips to home games, the whole thing. Now as the years went on, I paid less and less attention to the sport. I got older, and while I liked to go out and have a catch, the MLB wasn't really my thing anymore. The games felt too long and my team sucked ass consistently. Go O's. But I still liked baseball in my heart, and so I thought the show would be sufficient enough to get me to understand this whole sports game thing. Now that I've played it, meh? I played maybe 3 games and was like, yup. It's baseball, and never touched it again. I just can't get over the fact that I'm sitting on my ass watching a computer sim of a ball game when I could go outside and actually play a ball game. I know that argument is tired and everyone's sick of hearing it. Well, I'm sick of having to repeat myself. Let's divert course for a minute. I want to tell you about my roommate who loves baseball. He watches all of his team's games, keeps up with the league, and plays the show all the time. It makes more sense for him to play than for me. Not just because he's into baseball more than I am, but because he's a busy guy. Even he can't go out to have a catch whenever he wants. So in his free time, he plays the show, and that's cool. It's cool, but it ain't me. I don't care about baseball or any of these sports enough to play these games. I'd love to go out and have a catch, go to the batting cages, whatever. But if I can't do that, then I'd rather not spend my time trying to emulate it. That's not something I need. So what does this mean for MLB The Show 17? Well, I don't hate it. I think it's a fine game. I'm just not the demographic for this type of thing. The show, like all the other sports games I've played, does nothing for me. But I can admit I'm out of my league here. For me, personally, it's just a game. That's it.
5 out of 10.
I will admit that I had some fun with Rainbow Six Siege back in the day. Most of my time playing it was before they started adding all the new operators and stuff, but I still really enjoyed what they had even at the ground level. It had a really solid core gameplay loop that kept me coming back as long as my friends were down. I played a lot of CSGO when I was younger, so I was used to that 5v5 gameplay, but Rainbow Six was a different take, a refreshing one. It felt a lot more intimate than CSGO. There were way more close quarters situations and less room for error. It kept me on my toes the whole time. Both sides of the match felt equally as fun to me. Both defending and attacking had their own strategies, and I honestly couldn't tell you what I liked more. The operators were another addition that shook up the gameplay. It wasn't exactly as wild as characters in a hero shooter, but each operator still had their own strengths and tools that brought an extra layer of team composition. I really liked the gameplay of Siege, but I was really bad at it. This was the game that really made me realize how hard it was to be accurate with the controller, playing this on PS4. It was made more frustrating by how important it is to place your shots in this game, and how little health everyone has. I could place traps and infiltrate the map pretty alright. The overall strategy I was fine at as well. I wasn't great at reading the opponent, but I could often get our foot in the door. But in Rainbow Six Siege, it always comes down to the gunfight, and I couldn't deliver. Eventually, I waned off of R6 because of this. I felt like I let down my team, and as much as I wanted to play with my friends, I just wasn't having fun anymore. So I took a break. And then they started adding operators while I was away, and I just gave up returning based on how much the meta had changed. Games like R6 are in a weird place for me. They aren't really that fun to just troll or dick around in, because if you're ever against a competent team, I'll get my ass whooped and I won't even get to play. But I'm also not good enough to get enjoyment from taking it seriously. It was always fun to play with friends, but I would never play this game by myself. The other option for me would be single player, but Rainbow Six Siege doesn't really have a single player. Technically it does, but it's not very fun at all. It's very obvious that the gameplay is balanced around 5v5 multiplayer, and so the single player felt shoehorned in for people like me, but it's not something I enjoyed anyway. I think Rainbow Six Siege is fine. Maybe if I played it on PC I'd like it more, I don't know. But right now I don't really enjoy it as much as I used to. For those who are still in the scene and all that, I hope you really do enjoy it. It's just not my thing anymore.
6 out of 10!
So usually while I write these reviews, I put on the soundtrack for whatever game I'm writing about. It helps me get motivated to start writing and helps me remember what my experience was like with each title. I guess I'm just sonically focused like that. It's a big part of the experience. Well, for Sonic Forces, I put on the first track, Fist Bump, and immediately skipped. The next track also grated my ears, and I remembered that I won't like a single track I'm gonna listen to. To me, Sonic Forces feels like an aesthetic disaster. It's not terrible to play, but the tone is so hilariously bad. There was a big outcry for a more edgy interpretation of Sonic after a series like Sonic Boom took Sonic into a direction much more concerned with engaging kids than longtime fans. As they often do, Sonic Team seemed to take this personally and made Sonic Forces way too over the top edgy. We've got cartoon animals talking about war and torture and death, and it's just like, come on. I mean, the main villain is a talking jackal with some Air Jordans and a superiority complex. Other more serious games had their edgy moments, but were usually on top of this base understanding that yeah, this is basically a game meant for kids. Forces seems like it wants to ignore all that and pander to the old curmudgeons who didn't grow up past Adventure 2. To be honest, I'm probably one of them, but I don't like being pandered to. So yes, Sonic Forces aesthetically is a disaster. It's an embarrassment to its own franchise, but gameplay wise, I don't actually find it that bad. It's not as great as Colors or Generations, not by a long shot, but I had an okay time with Forces. Out of all three gameplay styles, the only one I outright dislike is Classic Sonic. He feels shoehorned in at the last minute with his incredibly wonky physics. Sonic and the custom character control almost exactly the same, just one has a gun and the other can boost. They aren't amazing, but they're fun enough. I had a fun time playing through most of their levels going for S ranks. I wish I could say better about the level designs. They range from sleep-inducing to mildly interesting, but in all cases they're super short. Sonic Forces in general is really short. It only took me about 3 hours to get through the story, and I remember having a friend play it who didn't play a lick of Sonic, and he beat it in one sitting as well. That's probably why Forces doesn't leave a lasting impression on me. Sometimes I just want to rip this game for all the wrong messages it took from its audience, but I mean, who cares? Sega and Sonic Team are forever stuck in this struggle to understand this abomination of an audience they've created, and I feel like Forces is just another footnote in this journey. Hell, I didn't even go into the custom character that much, a clear attempt to sell to fans who want to put their OCs into everything. Forces is just here. It's not as bad as 06 or Boom, it's nowhere near as good as Colors, Generations, or even the adventure games to me. If tomorrow I woke up and I was the only one who remembered Sonic Forces, I'd say, you weren't missing much.
5 out of 10.
So as much as I like them, I never actually grew up with the classic Sonic titles. I respected them for being groundbreaking titles and genuinely good games, but I didn't really have that really tight bond with them like most classic Sonic fans seem to have. All of this is to say, I wasn't very hyped for the announcement of Sonic Mania. I was glad to see Sonic fans finally get what they were asking for at least. The coolest part to me was that the development was being handled by a bunch of fans who got their start in the community making mods and fan games. To see them make an official Sonic game, an original one at that, was honestly kind of inspiring. It also helps that Sonic Mania ended up being a fantastic game as well. It's weird that Sonic Mania came out over 20 years after the last classic game because it feels like they haven't missed a beat. Mania's physics and controls are pretty much the same as the classic titles, and it's nice to finally have another game in this style after so many years and so many failed attempts by Sega. But Mania doesn't rest on its laurels either. In each level you'll find new gimmicks thrown at you, and the team also added the drop dash, a pretty ingenious tool that allows the player to skip that extra step of revving back up after a jump. Now, when I said Sonic Mania doesn't rest on its laurels just now, that was only half true. There is quite a bit here meant to tug on your nostalgia bone. While Mania still makes progress past the classic games, it doesn't take as big of a leap as the time gap may suggest. We've got a pixelated art style, which has come back around to being a popular artistic choice since its time in the 90s. Personally, I don't mind it. They don't entirely try to replicate the Genesis look. There are liberties taken which helps give the game its own identity. Next to that though, we have quite a lot of reused level aesthetics, straight up reusing good old Green Hill Zone and Chemical Plant among others. They look mostly the same, but again, there's notable differences that help them stand out. Things like adjusted looks and layering, remixed music, and entirely new layouts. And man, that music is great stuff. The remixes take a similar approach to the rest of the aesthetics by reusing some melodies and progressions and mixing in some new grooves, instruments, etc. But the original tracks are where Mania's soundtrack shines, if you ask me. It might be because I've heard some version of the remixed tunes so many times before, but the compositions of the original tracks are just wow. So groovy, so much energy, it's just so good. So Sonic Mania is a pretty great game. The only thing I didn't really like was the special stages. This isn't really a new thing for classic Sonic games either. I usually don't like them, and Mania carries that tradition. I think they look cool, but I don't like how they control. A lot of special stages in Sonic, including Mania, feel disconnected from the main level-to-level gameplay, and I never have as much fun with them, so I never get very far in the Emerald Hunt, which sucks because Super Sonic is really cool. But hey, Sonic Mania is still an awesome game. Even though it leans pretty heavily on the nostalgia, I think even new players can find some enjoyment in its mechanics. Sonic Mania just feels fun to play no matter what stage you're on, and that's a surefire way to get me to recommend a game.
9 out of 10!
Star Wars Battlefront is one of those games that was fun for like a few weeks and then you realize how little there actually is to do. It looks and sounds gorgeous, it plays pretty well too, but I probably only played it as much as I did because of the Star Wars property. Because in terms of content, EA's first Battlefront is pretty lacking. First off, where's the single player? I know most people are going to play the multiplayer, but they didn't even want to throw a bone to the single player crowd. That's kind of disappointing, especially considering what property we're working with. It could have been cool, but nope. No single player, and we barely got any offline multiplayer. The local multiplayer is really bare bones. They're just copy and pasted modes from the online, but the online modes are designed for tens of players at a time. Local multiplayer is just 2 to 4 people, so the oversized maps lead to an empty feeling. The best I got was letting each other turn into Jedi and having lightsaber fights, which we only did on maybe 2 separate occasions. So because Battlefront was so focused on the online multiplayer, they must have put a lot of effort into it, right? Well, they did, sort of. The online was admittedly pretty fun. It was also really repetitive. There's a pretty small map pool and just as small of a selection of game modes. Walker Assault was my favorite. To be honest, I don't even remember what the other ones were, probably because no one actually played the objectives. It was fun to play as a stormtrooper or a pilot or spaceship, but no one really cared about capturing points or anything like that. The most fun part of Battlefront was definitely playing as the heroes, special characters that could mow down troopers like no one's business. However, the heroes weren't dealt out evenly or randomly. The tokens used to get them would spawn in specific locations on each map, so you always had someone hogging them. Look, Star Wars Battlefront was fine, but it wore out its welcome pretty quickly to me. The repetitive online, the shamelessly rehashed offline, and the nail in the coffin was the season pass. They wanted to charge a premium for a roadmap of content that should have been in the game from the start. I felt a little skipped out, to be honest, and while Battlefront's core gameplay was alright, I could never get that taste out of my mouth.
5 out of 10!
The Last Guardian was one of those games whose hype kind of overshadowed the actual product. I like The Last Guardian. It's not the best game ever made, but I had a good time playing it. It probably helped that I wasn't one of those people who got their expectations up so high due to the hype. I've never played Shadow of the Colossus, the previous game from developer Team Ico. I heard it was a masterpiece, but it wasn't on my radar when it came out, and I just haven't gotten back to it these days. There's this sort of delay that happens when a dev creates a seemingly perfect game like Shadow of the Colossus. It's hard to see how good a game is before it comes out, but once it does and everyone can try it for themselves, they get excited for the next project. The Last Guardian was that next project. I believe it was in development for a long time, and from the very beginning it was put on this scale compared to Shadow of the Colossus. But it's hard to pump out masterpiece after masterpiece. There's a lot more that goes into it beyond having the same team. This is where I think people get ahead of themselves. I can imagine the problems with The Last Guardian were more scarring to those who let themselves think they were in for another landmark game. Not to say they were wrong for doing so, but as someone who wasn't super hyped for this game and bought it just to see what it was about, I was a little more forgiving of its flaws. The biggest problem was definitely Trico's AI. Trico sometimes has a hard time following directions, and because because this beast is so large, it can take some time before it actually responds to your commands. This makes progress feel extra slow, and mistakes feel even more annoying. I'm gonna be honest though, I didn't run into that many problems with Trico's AI. The worst part for me was just how I couldn't directly control it. Trico is the key to most of your progress, and when I want to progress, I have to tell my oversized dog to go where I want rather than just making it go there with my controller. I know this isn't the point of the game. The point is that you have to work together with Trico if you both want to make it out, but this is just a personal pet peeve of mine. I like most other things about The Last Guardian. The world Team Ego crafted was very interesting. It felt like there was a lot of history to the place, and I was really brought in by the art and lighting. I had a great time going through the story. By the end of the game, I could really tell I'd made a stronger bond with Trico, from enemies to reluctant teammates to best friends. The Last Guardian does a great job at exploring this concept, and man, that ending. So yeah, I like The Last Guardian. It's not the most groundbreaking thing I've ever played, it's not the most polished either, but I still had a good time. A game doesn't have to be a masterpiece to be worth playing. It can have problems and still be an overall positive experience. I think The Last Guardian is a perfect fit for this description. Not amazing, but I liked it.
7 out of 10!
I have a confession to make. I love skateboarding, but I'm a total poser. I love watching skate vids and following my favorite skaters, and every now and then I get inspired to pick up my board, but I can't do anything other than ride the board and do a 3-inch ollie max. I've landed maybe one pop shove in my whole life so far, but if being a poser means I get more time to play Tony Hawk, then I'm okay with that. The Tony Hawk games are a huge part of my childhood, which is weird because I really only played the original and a little bit of 4. Tony Hawk was fun enough for me to come back over and over, and when I was really into the Pro Skater games, THPS 5 was the latest one, and well, there was no way I'd play that. After 5, I was pretty sure the franchise was dead, but in 2020 we were gifted with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 remake, and I was hyped out of my mind. It looks so good, and yeah, it was amazing. There's this really simple joy that comes from playing Tony Hawk. It's all about expression in these games. THPS 1 and 2 really capitalizes on this concept by providing an insanely high skill ceiling, wherein lots of different playstyles can thrive. It's one of those games where you can see that every person plays a little bit differently, and it makes watching other people play just as enjoyable as playing myself. Being a remake of 1 and 2, you get all the maps from those games retrofitted with the new mechanics that have been introduced since then. Most of the maps are really well made. A good Tony Hawk map gives you a playground in which you're given a lot of different routes to take your combos, and I think most of the maps do that pretty well. So Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 has struck gold in terms of its gameplay loop, but its aesthetics are near perfect too. Vicarious Visions went for a more realistic approach to the graphics, and I think it looks great. Textures, lighting, models all look good. The only thing that looks kind of weird to me is the faces. They scanned in the faces of each skater to capture their look, and I don't know how to feel about it. They feel a little uncanny if you ask me, but it's not like you're spending your time having a staring contest with Rodney Mullen the whole game, so it isn't that big of a deal. I also want to give a special mention to the soundtrack. This is up there with one of my favorite game soundtracks of all time. It's full of awesome rock, punk, hip-hop, all that high energy stuff that gets your blood pumping. There's only maybe 2 tracks I'd skip. I'll let you guess which ones. I don't really have anything bad to say about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2. I love everything about it. It does get repetitive at points, playing the same maps and missions over and over, but even that didn't bother me because the core gameplay is so damn fun. The in-game achievements can be a bit much, but I'm not a completionist, so that stuff doesn't really bother me either. I think I just really like this game. It's definitely my favorite Tony Hawk game now, and probably the definitive Pro Skater experience. Who knows, maybe someday something will top Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, but right now, it's feeling pretty perfect to me.
Oh my god, it's a 10 out of 10!